The Butterfly's Dream by Kerber's 314, Chapter 11, an anecdote. Tell me, what makes you strong? It was a hard climb. It would have been just as hard under normal circumstances, but it was now near impossible with the sideways rain which was trying to knock her off the mountain. Still, she could tell she was headed in the right direction when the mud gave way to rock, and the rock gave way to claw marks gouged deep gashes, which provided her good footholds to press on ever higher up the steep slope. She had crescent rolls deployed for balance, the massive weapon keeping her grounded, and if need be, a lifeline which she could catch herself. She would call out again and again every few feet until her throat was raw, but there was still no reply from her sister or anything besides the roaring weather. The rough path would veer just underneath the crest and run parallel a sheer cliff face. Amazingly, the trail seemed to be incised into the granite itself, and the overhang would provide some shelter. She could she quickly sprinted the last few meters to the top and arrived in a huffing, shivering mess. The Out of the rain she would not find much comfort even then. She moved her hand off the rock to uncover a bloody patch which had not come from her. Oh no! Foreboding of cold and fatigue, she darted off down the meandering path, all the while trying hard not to look over the perilous edge. His eyes fluttered, still not quite awake. "I'm sorry." The girl gave him a patient smile. "I asked you what makes you strong, what drives you to push yourself so hard." Naruto smiled and sat up on his haunches, looking blearily at the herbs she was picking. "I want to protect my friends, the people precious to me." He looked her in the eyes, and his sincerity made her cheeks match the pink dress she was wearing. "I see." She went back to picking herbs. Naruto watched her delicate hands pluck the roots gently at the base. Ruby noticed the calluses on her hands, so similar to her own. "Then you are truly strong, aren't you?" "Yeah." Naruto rubbed his chest and turned his gaze inwards. "I guess I am." The rain was so thick on the other side that it felt like she was running through a tunnel. She must have gone a good mile, and had yet to see another sign that her sister had come this way. She began to consider that she might have gone the wrong direction, but then the path veered inward suddenly, and she slipped in her haste. She had to quickly use her semblance to avoid falling off the side of the mountain. The shockwave from her jump billowed away the rain in front and behind her, and in that abrupt empty space a face appeared, a horribly bony, beaked face. The griffins walked and roared all in one, and the sound blew the cold out of her. She braked hard, spun around to confront the beast even as it snapped at her with that rock-crushing jaw. She jerked Crescent Rose out of the way and slapped the creature upside the head before dropping to a knee and taking aim. If she had been but a little bit stronger, she might have dazed it long enough to get a clean shot, but as soon as the beast saw her line up her sights, it pulled back behind the curtain of water flowing over the side of the mountain. She fired anyway, hoping that the near point-blank range wouldn't give it enough time to dodge. The bullet made a slight tear in the watery shroud, but she could hear it echo out into the valley below, and knew she had just wasted the bullet. Turning on her heel, she kept running. There was still a chance the gang was out there ahead of her, and she couldn't just turn back. Her gait was just fast enough to avoid the beak snaking at the clock trailing behind her. It occurred to her that the griffin probably had a clear view of her shadow passing along the path, while she, on the other hand, hadn't any idea where it was going to strike next. Again, a water jutsu would be really awesome right about then, or the Byakugan, or wall walking, or an earth technique which would wall her off from the ordinary chimera, but she only had herself, and Crescent Rose. A claw, her match in size and strength, burst through the veil, and she threw herself down onto the rock as it swept blindly over her. She was pushing herself back up when it suddenly reversed direction, and she instead somersaulted into the air above it, but she also forgot that she was in a particularly enclosed space, and halfway through her flip she hit the ceiling, bounced like a ping pong ball from hard rock to equally hard rock. She ended up back on the roughly hemmed footpath. the angry roar of the griffin already dwarfed the endless rain. She quickly tried to get up again, perhaps too quickly, as her extended fatigue caught up to her, and she stumbled back onto the floor, which was now slick with the rain, being dragged in by the groping talons. The griffin chose then to make another go at her. The gaping beak sprung forth and had every intent of swallowing her whole down that bottomless black pit. Too unbalanced to take a swing at it, she instead got lucky as it made to clamp down on her, and instead got a headful of scythe. Crimson Rose, uh, Crescent Rose, held marvelous under the strain, but the same could not be said for the more fragile girl. The griffin jerked its head back and forth viciously, trying to dislodge the toothpick which had become wedged in its foot mouth, and dragging Ruby along for the ride. After enough back and forth, her flailing legs caught on a foothold. She hung on to her weapon and pulled with all her might. Her strength increased tenfold when she had enough presence of mind to enshroud her muscles in aura, which did the pushing and pulling for her, but she would simply never be as strong as people like her sister, and even she might not have been able to best this fearsome beast. At first its head jerked forward in surprise, but it quickly grew indignant with its prickly meal and withdrew its beak with more strength than Ruby could possibly hope to muster, and it pulled her out into the abyss. It whipped her back and forth over empty air. The ground so far beneath it might as well not have been there, but still she clung on, waiting for her chance to use her semblance and escape. Each thrash was a skip in her heart as she felt her weapon loose its hold, promising freedom from its clutches, but also terrifying freefall. The moment of release came, and her stomach dropped, but she pushed through that nauseating feeling and dredged up that familiar joy, that absolute and comforting warmth which came when aura touched every cell in her body, and her semblance accelerated her past the bonds of gravity. She flew, but like her bullet before her, she missed the passageway and ended up on the rock face, vertically, with nothing below to support her. Gravity seemed to mock her, giving her hope, and let her hang hundreds of meters away above the ground, and one of or two above the griffin. For all of a second, it came rushing back, and she fell, racing the wrong way. To use her semblance again, she looked into the ravenous and irate face of the grim, which had just now relocated its frightfully prey. She screamed, but it was less of a scream and more of a war cry as certainly she swung Crescent Rose along with her as she went down, down, down. The grim didn't have time to register what hit it as the scythe passed cleanly through its head, its beady red eyes blinking owlishly back at its own body before it dissolved to become one with the downpour. As did Ruby, as she continued to fall, the petals mixed with raindrops and saturated her even when she quit her speed. Throat already hoarse from before, Uh, she didn't stop her yell as it gave her renewed energy and desire to live. Following through on her swing, she twisted in the air and sunk her blade deep into the rock, crying out with the fits and starts as the blade struggled and searched through the hard stone. She came to a jerking stop, and her legs dangled out into the darkness. As she hung from the curled shaft of her weapon, she dared look down to see how close she was. Not close enough. She turned to look back up from whence she came. She could see neither the griffin nor the walkway as the heavens continued to unleash their tears down upon her, but she would save her own tears. She still had to find her sister, but the path was so far away, and it was still a long, long way to the ground, and she was tired, ever so tired. The torrential rain seemed like it had lasted for years and would go on till the end of time. The water dripped down the shaft and snuck under her hands, which still clung desperately to her lifeline. She knew she was slipping. She didn't know if she had enough energy for another jump that far. She didn't know if she had a choice. Ruby closed her eyes and tuned everything else out. Her breath slowed, and that became the sole focus of her existence. Just her breath. Naruto awoke to find himself alone again, For days now his life passed through the same routine. He would wake, train himself into exhaustion until he would collapse, and repeated the whole process from square one. Yamato estimated they had a week or so before Zabuza came for them again. He wanted to make the most of that time, but no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling of impotence. He wanted to be strong enough, but he would always be just a powerless spectator. It was nighttime. He had no idea what hour. That begged the question of what Ruby was doing. He couldn't seem to remember. Was she awake right now too? Was he taking her away from something important just so he could stare at the stars? It occurred to him he ought to know, but it also occurred to him that he might not really be awake. He wondered what sort of dreams everyone else had. You could do anything in your dreams. People told him that when he dared ask, offhandedly as he could to make it seem he didn't care. Sometimes he wished he had those kinds of dreams, the ones which were bizarre and perfect. Until he realized this was one of those dreams, his hands reached out to grasp the stars, twinkling lights falling into his dirty palm, thousands upon thousands of pinholes piercing the blanket of night. Someone told him something once, which he only remembered now, that each of those lights was another sun, like their own, and that somewhere out there other people were staring back, listening. You hear that, Ruby? He never doubted she was listening. This is our dream. He never doubted he was not alone. We can do anything. Thunderstruck, and her eyes shot open, or maybe it was the other way around, her hand tightened against the unbending metal, so tight she might have heard the tiny bones in her hand crack, but she paid it no mind, nor anything else, as her focus once again returned inward. Ruby closed her eyes and tuned everything else out. Her breathing slowed, and that became her center, and from there she branched out until every part of her came into reach of those spindly fingers of energy. The infinite connections which spread like roots throughout her body, she used those and pulled herself up to the surface until she could taste fresh air once again. She breathed. Lightning struck. A crimson bolt span from the ground to the heavens, ionizing even the water trapped within the molecules of the rock with a crackling hiss. The curtain of rain parted like the Red Sea, torn asunder by the intensity of her speed. Her path ahead and behind her, even the clouds parted to pay their respect to her encore, and she was among the stars. She was already standing beneath the corns when the rain began to fall again. She fell on her butt, immune to the tremor the hard rock sent up her spine. If she had been tired before, she was exhausted now. It was funny, she couldn't remember not being this way. When she closed her eyes, he was tired. When they were open, she was tired. But there was a smile on her face nonetheless, because just a stone's throw below her she could see several shapes moving towards her in the darkness. It was surprising that she could make out anything that far away. The rain must have been letting up, or the sun was shining. Either way, it was clear enough to let her see these weren't more grim here to finish the job. There was too much joy in her heart for that to be the case. Ruby! The nearest blob yelled in a voice that was hoarse but recognizable. Yang, she croaked, breaking into coughs. Ruby! Ruby! Over here! She wanted to be embarrassed as she realized half the class must be out looking for her, scattering around the mountain range, but there was not enough energy left in her to be happy and embarrassed at the same time, so she stuck with the former. I found you, Yang! Her voice was so deep it was beginning to sound like Naruto's. She hoped that she didn't get pneumonia after all this. Found me? I was looking for you, but she looked more apologetic and relieved than angry. I suggested we head back to camp, and I thought that you were right behind the whole time until I got there and you weren't following me. She tried to put on a humored smile, but Ruby could tell it was extracted from the muddy guilt. You'd think your cape would be the perfect thing, but turns out that at night it looks sort of blue. Ruby was the only one who found any humor in that factoid, though her father shushed her when she tried to laugh. Easy there, Ruby. Taiyang admonished her, sounding every bit out of breath as she was. Are you all right? Any injuries? She just shook her head and tried to stand to illustrate her point, but the butt of Crescent Rose slipped on the wet rock under her weight, and she almost went down. Careful there, sis! Yang shot an arm underneath her sister and hiked the smaller girl up under her shoulder. I thought you had taken the path up the mountain. Huh? But why would you think that? That's the opposite way to camp. Yang frowned. And I'm not that bad with directions, but the blood? Blood? A paint marker? Taiyang supplied with a grimace. The teachers and I put those up to denote the places the students shouldn't go. There's too many Elder Grin up there for junior students to handle. Her father clenched his fist and smashed them into a nearby rock. Of course I went up there anyway just to check. We must have just passed one another in the rain. Ruby could tell her father was beating himself up over losing track of her, but she didn't want him to blame either himself or Yang, so she tried to forward the conversation. How did you find me? Funny thing, Yang looked over at their father as well, wondering what he was going to say about it. I thought I saw a flash of lightning strike just off the cliff face. He scratched his beard and looked off into the distance at the foreboding peak. Weird thing is, seemed to me like the flash was red. Figured that's a divine sign if ever there was one. Hear that, Ruby? Yang said, nudging her sister. Guess we're going to have to call you Thunder God now, or maybe Lightning Queen. Please don't. The girl mumbled, words beginning to slur as her eyelids drooped. Okay, okay, I gotcha, Yang said, scooping up her sopping wet body, accessories and all, her drenched cape swaddling the two. Despite the ludicrous amount of water soaked into the garment, the wool still kept some heat in, and curled up on her sister's back, she felt more at ease than she had been for some time. She was asleep before her head settled on her sister's shoulder. I think it's about time we head back, Taiyang proclaimed, looking off to see the sun just beginning to light up the sky and define the end of the storm. You read my mind. Naruto's eyes flickered awake, lazily scanning the forest glen, looking for what might have awoken him. There was nothing. Again, not even a rabbit scurrying about in the underbush. It had passed the darkest hour of the night, and was well on its way to dawn. All was calm. That was the thing most people didn't really understand. You could lose track of time and still know the difference between dawn and dusk. Dawn was cooler, damp, now that the water in the air had beaten down from the night, and the sounds of wildlife, the stirring were just on the edge of perception, the crescendo just noticeable enough even through the haze of sleep. Naruto shivered as a feeling of cold swept past him, and then it was gone. There you are! He turned his head slowly to the voice, like he had always known it was there. Here I am. Were you out here all night again by yourself? There was exasperation, but also a slight bit of amusement in the question. Maybe concern. No. A roll of pupilless eyes which clearly didn't believe him. You do know we're still in enemy territory. Try not to do anything reckless again, will you? The smirk he sent him appeared to be far less scathing than it had been, and Naruto wondered if it was just a trick of the light, or if he was beginning to hopefully. He just shrugged anyway, stood up and dusted himself off. I told you, I'm perfectly fine. Sure. Naruto had the decency to blush as his stomach protested loudly. Come on, Neji sighed, turning back the direction he assumed he had come from. Tsunami-san is making breakfast, and Yamato-sensei and Tenten were worried about you. And you? The blonde asked, failing into step amidst the waking forest. No. Naruto stopped just a few paces ahead of Neji and looked back at the older boy. You can take care of yourself. A smile on both faces as the sun rose, a bright one which warmed Ruby's heart inside and out. Yeah, but it's nice to have friends looking out for you all the same. Hey there, up and about already? Ruby just smiled and closed her diary unhurriedly, not trying to hide anything, or rather, hiding it in plain sight. Nope, she replied cheerily and stretched like a cat over the length of a warm cot. Now, bathed in a few days' sunlight, in a new day's sunlight, having touched on the important parts of what she'd remembered wanting to tell Naruto, she tucked the green leather-bound notebook under her pillow and fluffed it up to give her back more support. So I see. Yang gave her a smile almost as brilliant as the light outside the tent flap. Well, take your time. We don't leave until tomorrow evening. Oh, it'll be so nice to sleep in a real bed. You're telling me, her sister grimaced in annoyance. This camping stuff is for the birds. It does a number on my hair, and I finally got it the way I like it. She grumbled the last part as she twisted a frayed strand under her finger. tips. Ruby laughed heartily, only coughing once, which caught her sister's worried eye, but the younger girl gave it no mind as she found humor in her sister's newest obsession and did not dwell on her own infirmity. Though, even if she did not have the other girl as a distraction, she would hardly be wont to think of herself idle. She could do nothing but think of Naruto, and her mind revolved around ways to help him in his predicament. She knew he felt guilty about what had happened to her, just as her father and sister did, but she didn't hold it against any of them. There was nothing they could have done, and it was all her fault anyway. To her, it was just another motivation to improve herself even further, and that made her happy. Seeing the content smile on her sister's face radiated over to Yang as she temporarily forgot her own aggravations and tried to find the bright side like her sibling always managed to do. In truth, Ruby was one of Yang's biggest inspirations. "Hey, it's a beautiful day out. Why don't we get some air in here?" It was indeed a beautiful day, now that the clouds had exhausted themselves of rain and limped off beyond the horizon. The sun warmed the tent nicely, making up for the thin blanket draped over Ruby's legs, but it was stuffy, and she welcomed the flaps being tacked back, and the small breeze which wafted in past the damp canvas. "What you thinking about?" Yang caught her sister just staring out into the bright sunlight, so real, so close, and yet out of her reach, at least as long as she was restricted to her bed by overbearing teachers/parents. The blonde had sat down at the head of the cot as Ruby leaned into her for support. Yang glanced down briefly as her hand met the hard-back spine of Ruby's diary. Nothing much. What was on her mind was the Fubar mission, a doomed nation, a tyrant, another child deprived of a parent, a cleaver-wielding demon, a kind soul trapped in an unwinnable situation. The usual stuff. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yeah, it is." It started off as a nice day. It had quickly changed. It began with the arrival of two unsavory individuals at the front door of their host's house. They were dealt with easily, but like a swig of rancid milk that was spit out right afterwards, the unwarranted appearance left a bad taste in their mouth, an upset stomach which lasted all the way to the bridge, and once there they wanted to puke. There were bodies strewn about, strewn all over the place, incalculable in the encroaching mist. "He's here. Stay sharp." Right. He always vowed to heed Yamato Sensei's words. He wasn't going to let it be like last time where Neji had surprised him without trying. This enemy wasn't going to announce their presence beyond the calling card he already left them. Ruby saw the bodies and wanted to turn away, to not watch. She couldn't. It was already too late. I didn't get a chance to say this before, but for some no-name babysitter, you're not half bad. Sabaza was already waiting for them, as they guessed, but he made no effort to hide, and in fact stood opposite them as if waiting for the chance to introduce the masked fake hunter by his side, who in reality didn't need any introduction. Naruto drew a sharp breath, and his hand clapped down on the hilt of his kusarigama, the familiar action of running his thumb over the ribbed pattern, saving him from drowning in the killing intent, which was as thick as the fog. "You see it too, don't you, Naruto?" The hands, the hands of the hunter were unmistakable, at least to her. She could focus on them, as she was less subject to the intense pressure from the impending battle. That didn't mean she wasn't worried, though. "Remember the plan," Yamato said playfully without looking away from the Kirin ninja or making a move whatsoever. "Tenten, Naruto, hi!" And like that, the four of them leaped into action, their adversaries content to watch the little plan unfold. Neji planted himself in a low stance in front of the bridge builder, any unknowns that being struck on the sidelines hidden behind his fierce expression, face taut as a drumstick, which highlighted his special eyes. Naruto and Tenten were already halfway to the expected Hunternen, even though the masked shinobi made no effort to intercept them. Both knew that it wouldn't take long for that to change. They were wary of the ninja, which had perpetuated to take out Zabuza the first time. Halfway there, Naruto suddenly disappeared in a swirl of crimson leaves, which were torn to bits up by the fierce winds. But rather than be surprised by this abrupt use of the shunshin, the hunterman almost seemed to expect the re-emergence of a hooked blade behind his head as they ducked unerringly to avoid it. They drew a senbon in retaliation and pivoted on a heel to drive the spike into Naruto's heart, but with incredibly tight precision, the blade was deflected from an intervening kunai thrown from the side, and the boy's sickle was followed by a low kick which nearly buckled the enemy's extended leg. Surprised by the tight coordination, the hunter ninja made to temporarily withdraw to coax out a bit more of their opponent's abilities. They jumped back with a handful of senbon and covering their evaluation covering their evasion. Each of the metal needles lodged into a chain link as Naruto drew his combination weapon across his body, and before the masked ninja could begin to gauge the blonde's prowess with the weapon, they were reminded of the other enemy when a series of kunai began harrying them. The consecutive stream of projectiles were batted away with a single senbon. The two neophyte shinobi saw the effortless deflection and instead of getting discouraged, pressed on forward, and likewise their opponent did everything in their power to halt their process. And so it went. The two genin continued to battle Zabuza's associate, each side surprised the other and escalating the fight as it dragged on and on and became more and more deadly. Somewhere off in the mist, Death was already in attendance, just waiting for his chance. Metal clanged and waved crashes on concrete. Trees grew and withered, and their united fate was tentatively being decided, and all was observed only by one who could do nothing but watch and record with a bias towards the blue-eyed shinobi. Ruby wanted nothing more than to shout out, to take control, to warn Naruto of whom was at the other end of his blade. But then a terrifying thought occurred. What if he already knew? Was he aware that the masked ninja he was battling was the same effeminate boy they had met in the woods? It felt so long ago, but she knew neither of them had forgotten, despite the memory trying to hide in the fog. She didn't want to imagine it, but also couldn't deny the possibility that he knew and yet fought on with murderous intent. It confused and repulsed her, but mostly it just scared her. Was this what the life of a shinobi was like? Was this where her life was headed as well? One day it would be grim, the next she wanted to rebel, but it was lost without a place to start. In her distraction, she missed the moment when the ice formed. The boy, Haku, she remembered, had quickly gone from a sparring use of his ability to the antithesis of his technique when he realized that the combination of Naruto's speed and Tenten's long-range attacks were not to be taken lightly. Ruby wanted to be proud that they had pushed him this far, this fast, but to her shame found she couldn't. She was too worried for Naruto's sake. She looked through his eyes to see a hall of mirrors in every direction, each one of them showing the white lacquered mask, which looked almost sad at what it was about to do. She couldn't see Naruto's face in the reflection, and she worried what she was missing by not knowing what was there. "You are truly strong, aren't you?" "Yeah, I guess I am," he answered predictably, deliberately. It became clear to all that Naruto had not forgotten the encounter. "You became strong to protect your precious people. I can't let you hurt them. I know, and you must understand that I likewise cannot allow you to interfere with Zabuza-sama." Ruby would never forget the name. He was like grim incarnate, feeding off of people's fear. How someone like that could be held in regard by anyone was an outlandish thought. "He's going to hurt people. He's trying to kill my friends." Ruby could hear the upset in Naruto's voice and begged him not to do anything rash. Of course, he couldn't hear her pleas. "This is the life of a shinobi. We have no choice. We are just tools to serve someone else's dream." A tool? What a strange comparison. Tools were reliable, tough, useful, like Crescent Rose. She'd never given it any thought before, but which one of them was the tool? Which of them served the other most usefully? And if she was honest, which bore the greater responsibility? "You're wrong." Naruto's denial was vehement, a stalwart. "You claimed Zabuza is precious to you. If that's the case, you can't be his tool. To have someone that's precious, that's a two-way street. You can't be his tool because you are precious to him too." The two listeners were more taken aback by this simple statement than all of the jutsu combined. Of course, Ruby thought, instantly devastating herself of those insecurities. I should have realized. She should have trusted Naruto more. She should have trusted herself more. Is that so? Even behind his mask, Hako looked ruffled. The tiniest jerk of his shoulders were reflected 1,000 times over. It's a noble thought, but at the end of the day, it is merely a philosophical question, answered only by action. So, tell me, Naruto-kun, which is more precious? Which of you is more valuable, you or your teammates? Ruby could feel Naruto's heart leap into his throat at the mention of Tenten, even though she was outside of the ice cage and he was the one who posed the biggest threat to Haku. Don't you dare hurt her, Naruto growled, and Ruby was once again afraid that he might not be able to restrain himself from killing, mainly because in the same situation she didn't know if she would be able to either. It's over, Haku. I can escape your trap anytime I want. It's just a matter of time before I break your mirrors. You are fast, the boy conceded, but fast enough. I wonder. He could easily flicker out of the dome before Haku attacked could reach him. Of that he was certain, but the fact that the emotionless image had yet to make a move to act upon the threat worried him more than the weapon's brandishing in anger. Both he and Ruby realized what was happening at the same time. Genjutsu, more like a mirage, but Naruto ignored his words as he shot his gaze past the spaces between the ice mirrors and into the mist beyond, looking for something he'd known when he saw it. Tintin! It was just a dark spot sprayed on the backdrop of mist, but he could feel what was happening in the middle of it like he was there himself. In a way, he was. A mirror world where the slogan was, "Objects are further away than they appear." I am sorry, Naruto. If only he could have been a bit faster. Kaiten! The blanket of mist seemed to shrug away from the structure, balloon outwards, and slough off the top as a single nucleus of energy drilled through the barrier. Neji! Naruto was by the boy's side within the second, deflecting a volley of senpon which followed immediately after the rotation stopped. Tintin is guarding Tazuna, Neji huffed, answering Naruto's unasked question. I substituted myself with her when I realized what he was planning. The boy's teammate nodded his thanks, but did not otherwise have time to respond, as another salvo of darts rained down on the both of them. Neither came out of the exchange unscathed. Yes, well done. You have answered my question at least, though I hesitate to say that the girl is worth both of your lives. I don't intend for anyone to die here. Ruby grew happier with those words and the imperceptible effect they had on Haku, even as she tried to ignore the gut-wrenching sound as Naruto ripped a few senbon out of his arm. I am sorry to say, but you are now within my real trap, and I have already disabled some of the pressure points in your limbs. I do not think you will be getting out of this time. Quite up, quit apologizing, the blondin jerky yelled as he fell uselessly on the slabs of frozen water. Just do something about it. He threw out the sagely words of advice with bravado, but the weighted chain and even the pig-like point of his kusurigama veiled his hopelessness with their inability to pierce the hardened ice. Very well. Oh, how Ruby wished she could help Naruto the way he helped her. To do that would be worth becoming a tool with no desire of her own, but as his strikes were ineffectually against the reinforced ice, so too were her silent pleas. 64 palms. The hands started out in rapid succession, plucking the needles out of the air like flies. However, like her, now Naruto was not alone. 16, 34, 64. Even as the fusillade of needles continued to rain down on them, Neji's voice cut through the cacophony of whistles like a siren screaming out the score. 128. An exuberant cry marked the end of the storm. Gotcha! The mate steel chain extended from Naruto's hand to one of the mirrors, wrapped solidly around something that looked like a python, but later realized it to be a foot. The sharp intake of breath which must have been there was muffled by the ice, but the detonating material did nothing to mute the odd, wrenching, crackling sound as Naruto heaved on the other end of the coil and the fake Kanjunin was forcibly extracted from the ice like a fish out of water. Neji moved to the blonde's side. to strike out at the incoming targets, but despite Haku's surprise at being snagged, the shifty ninja was not able to become obsolete without a fight. He twisted while being dragged through the air and threw a hand out towards Naruto. Time seemed to stop as the widening blue eyes comprehended the dagger of ice traveling down the length of the chain. But neither person behind those eyes could do anything about it. Neji diverted his palm at the last second and batted the projectile away while Haku continued his path to the ground. The sound of his body bouncing off the concrete snapped Naruto out of his paralyzed trance. He wasted no more time in taking the chain down into the earth with his blade and flickering over to the ensnared ninja within a heartbeat. The first punch cracked the mask and waved Haku's head back as he tried to sit up. The second batted him the other direction and sent the lacerated shards flying. The third hung for just a second as the unadorned face stared back impassively at their impeding defeat, but only a second, as the cocked fist then buried itself into his gut and forced him onto his knees in search of spoiled air. "Finish me!" the battered voice wheezed out, staring straight up at the slowly dissolving mirrors. "You are finished," Naruto declared as he retrieved his kusarigama, wrapping the rest of the chain around his waist. "Can't you realize it's over? Then I have failed." The sounds of battle in the distance died off as well, and there was a morbid stillness throughout the bridge. "I am a broken tool, of no use to Zabuza." Naruto looked back to his teammate, who had just recovered from his successive use of two high power techniques and was silently patting over them. "I keep telling you, you're not a tool." He turned his side back to the shinobi slumped over on the asphalt. "A broken tool can be cast aside, replaced. A bond is not so easy. That's why I'm not going to kill you. I don't want to be the one to break that bond." "But I failed him," Haku said matter-of-factly, uncaring for the blood dribbling down his chain. "You must kill me. What use is there for weakness?" But because unlike tools, you can come back better than before. We can pick up our pieces and reforge them, make something better than what was there originally. It's through knowing our faults we improve. It's through our weakness we get stronger. Ruby listened with a contemplative air to those words of truth, though she was the one to work at the flame and metal with tender care and her own hands. This also made her prone to see her work as perfection. But Naruto was right. Someday Crescent Rose might not live up to the task and would break under the strain, but they never would. They'd be able to hammer out the cracks in their lives and rehone themselves better than before. But the only reason that was true was because they had another watching out for the signs of weakness, ready to step in with a healing touch. Haku chuckled grimly. "It's strange to give encouragement to an enemy. I hope you won't be an enemy forever." Naruto smiled softly down at the defeated shinobi. "I like to consider you one of my precious people. Have your pieces added into what becomes a part of the new me." Ruby saw Neji flinch in the peripheries as Naruto extended a hand to their abjectly defeated adversary, but Naruto didn't pay it any mind, and the stoic Hyuga held his tongue as Haku regarded the invitation with an awe that was almost too much for his wary nerves to handle. But where he didn't have energy to argue, he raised the shaky arm instead. "One of these days, your kindness will get you killed, Naruto." Naruto just smiled as he helped the other boy to his feet and bore his weight on his shoulder, taking Neji's downer and suspicious attitude in stride. The mist was already sublimating into thin air. "Not soon, I think." Naruto felt the whippet-like body tense around his shoulder, and he followed the Haku's gaze across the black top. Sabuza-sama, the Ronin Jonin sensei, was standing in front of a brandle of trees, a bonsai forest right there on the bridge, and deeply ensconced in the thickly wooden copse was the familiar face they were looking for, dark, gaunt, and bowed, leaning forward with arms shackled by the scraggly branches. "He's alive," though the Byakugan user did not sound happy to pronounce this, even though he knew Neji held reservations about this lenient approach. Naruto was still grateful that the boy could put his own animosity aside. He also secretly held some pride, which assumed Yamato had spared the man's life for his sake, although he knew better. There was an exhale of breath, and he wasn't sure if it was his own or Haku's. It's over. Not quite. The dark-haired Genin was no longer regarding the closing session of the adults, and was instead looking up the bridgeway, far past where the vapor still shrouded the path ahead. The relief they felt was quickly reversed, and a renewed surge of apprehension swept over them all. Gato Neji sounded more like his old, condescending self when he said that name, and he brought friends, a lot of them. That's not good. I think I'm nearing the end of my chakra. The body flicker ate up a lot with the way he used so wantingly. Did he have enough to take the dwarfish man's head in one jump? Would that be enough to demoralize the countless mercenaries into fleeing? Hmm. His teammate nodded shallowly past his stern visage. Can't say I am much better, and our acquaintances looks to be on his last legs. Haku made no move to protest or turn his eyes away from the rapidly retreating fog line. Well, what do we do? Ruby had no advice to offer, even if she could. Protocols for encountering a horde were to flee or else seek shelter. None of that applied here. She thought about what Naruto would do, what he would say, but then realized that she would say the same thing. Fuck it. Well, maybe not quite that. Eloquent as always, Uzumaki. And I told you to call me. I know, I know. The two deliberately stepped forward a few paces as Naruto laid his burden back on the ground. Just make sure to watch my back, Naruto. Huh. Teme, you watch mine. Each exchange of words brought the silhouette more into focus, but as it was, they still had the advantage of surprise. They might be able to take the lot of mercenaries in one go. Stand down. They both glanced to where their sensei was walking calmly over to them, giving only a fleeting glance to the injured and unmasked accomplice who was tracking him intently. You've done a fine job. Take a break. The two Genin stared at the man like he had just grown a second head, but the truly surprising thing was the unbound demon of the mist walking up behind him. Like Yamato, Sabuza only gave the teenagers an impassive second of regard before cocking his head at their instructor, who was watching it all out of the corner of his large brown eye. I do this, and we're square, right? The Mokuton user gave a stiff nod as the battered and bruised man set a dislocated elbow back in with nary a grunt, but with a sickening pop, which they were sure even Gato's men could hear. Forgive me if I don't much trust a man with so many secrets, he leered at Yamato. As I see it, you don't have much of a choice, the man answered coolly, forcing Zabuza's expression to morph into a grimace and shift over to his disabled subordinate. He stared at Haku for what felt like a minute before turning towards the apprehensive blonde who had unwittingly taken a step back towards his former adversary. You, Blondie, make sure he keeps his word. Got it? Naruto nodded, despite not understanding what he was being asked to do, and with a half-satisfied grunt, the former demon turned his back on all of them, dutifully ignoring the heated and imploring gaze from his protege. Take care of Haku, Zabuza. Don't! The man's harsh words easily beat out the whisper. Just don't look back. His abused and weary joints cracked and popped as he flexed the only arm which still seemed to be usable, the other hanging limply by his side. Anyone got my sword? Here, sir. The familiar yet impish voice rang out behind them, dwarfed by the massive sword it was hiding behind. You make quick work, girl. He held the arm out without looking back. Tintin scurried quickly to return the blade, which she obtained from God's new ware, and hopped back as soon as the leathery hand clamped down on the sharkskin handle. As she retreated back to where her charge was waiting for her, Yamato sent her a withering look, but did not utter a reprimand. She had not, after all, abandoned Tazuna as the man clearly approached them on his own initiative. You're welcome to come and see me off, bridge builder. The massive cleaver snapped up in his grip. Just don't try and get in my way anymore. I'm with Yamato-san on this. You're square with me now. I ain't gonna do shit. Hmm, good. Was no one going to stop him? The man was the walking dead already. Even she could see that his breathing was labored. cracked ribs likely poking into places they shouldn't, no matter the good intentions. Blunt trauma was every bit as deadly for a man who knew no pain. And the last question for a dead man, even he knew it. Why was everyone just letting him do this? Forgive me, this is probably not an appropriate time to mention it, but as one of the legendary seven swordsmen, it's just a fucking blade. Take it, sell it. What do I care what you do with it? Can't take it with me where I'm going. Ruby loved weapons, she really did, but even she would be appalled to consider that more important than someone's life. Unfortunately for her, she didn't have time to be appalled with Yamato's skewed sense of priorities. The crazed swordsman discharged himself from the Inquisition and blitzed straight at the shadowy crowd. He was moving incredibly fast for someone whose blood was probably sloshing around in his gut. Gato and his men noticed the demon only seconds before he reached them. Ah, the legendary demon of the No, wait, what are you doing? I'm your employee. Just shut up and die already. They were all unwillingly spectators to the massacre. The swiftness nor justice did anything to make it any more palatable. The fact that Gato cowered like a dog did nothing to make him any less human, but still no one would make a move to stop it. No one would make a sound. The last of waves would gain its independence that day on a bridge christened in blood. Do not be so surprised. This is the way many good stories start. Rivers are crossed up best when dead and dry, tenets of freedom won only after hardship, and heavens reached on the piled backs of corpses. What comes next is usually better. Generations afterwards taking to heart those hard-earned lessons, but in that better life, do not forget its humble beginnings. Even as we reject that prehistoric existence, we forgot the teachings with the world we know, falling from the Tower of Babel, unable to comprehend how we got there in the first place. Maybe that was the problem with Remnant. They had been peaceful and complacent for too long, forgetting what it truly meant to not be at war. The message in names of color lost on those who heard them every day. Concepts of tolerance and acceptance intangible for people who never needed them before. Maybe they had forgotten the lessons which pulled them from the ashes of a broken world. One thing was true though, neither Ruby nor Naruto would ever forget what happened ever again. End of chapter 11.